Well, the whole world has been stunned by the speed with which the Assad regime has fallen in Syria. All over, start to finish, in less than 3 weeks. Quite extraordinary. Assad, who'd started off, I think for many, with great hope. Somebody who trained in London, married a woman in London. We thought maybe Western influences would come to Syria, things would change. Actually, arguably, it turned into a complete nightmare. And then we had the rebel forces, and it was always complicated to know who are they? Were they Al-Qaeda? Were they ISIS? What are the current group of people? I don't know. There's been great rejoicing that Assad has gone, and it leaves a very, very big open question. Yesterday, we saw Germany, Austria, Sweden, and then slightly France, then slightly belatedly the United Kingdom say, right, we're halting all asylum applications. And I guess there are two reasons for that. One is you could say, well, now that Assad has gone, it's a perfectly safe country, so why should anybody want to claim asylum here? But the second and perhaps more sinister one is, does it mean that there'll be people now leaving Syria, maybe those who committed murderous acts in the name of Assad? Does it mean those who fought for ISIS that have maybe been freed from some of these prisons that might start to come in our direction? Maybe one very good example through which we can debate this is Shamima Begum. Should she now be allowed to return? Will she possibly be allowed to return? And remember, she's lost every court case in this country. Tell me what you think in the light of the fall of that regime. Should she be allowed to come to the UK? Farage at gbnews.com. And it's complicated. No one quite knows how things will settle down in Syria. But I'm joined in the studio, not for the first time, by Tasnime Akunjee, Shamima Begum's your family lawyers. You're not her lawyer, you're the family's lawyer. Now, you've made these arguments over years. You've lost court case after court case. And the answer is, we've said her citizenship has gone, she can't return to the country, but you think that things may have changed?
Well, the situation is that her case is now going to go to the European courts, but the court cases that have been lost have been about the decision that was originally made by a politician, Sajid Javid, around an individual status. Now, we haven't had a jury trial with Shamima Begum. No evidence has been put of any wrongdoing to her in UK law. But what the Supreme Court had actually decided was that Parliament had given themselves such power that they felt that they couldn't question that. And that itself is an erosion of the idea of the separation of powers that is the fundamental basis of our society, which is that we don't have politicians making decisions about individuals. We allow that for the courts. And Lord Anderson at the time, criticising the whole rubric around stripping, suggested that a better approach would have been for a Home Secretary to be able to refer to a judge a request to have somebody's citizenship stripped, and then that checked in light of the law.
Why does the fall of the Assad regime make you think it's more likely her case might get reconsidered?
Well, I think the issue there is what is the impact that's going to happen on her and all the other people who are in those sort of camps. And we don't know the answer to that at the moment. The camps are actually being run by the Kurdish forces who were previously against Assad, but then were co-opted into his army. And they're currently being bombarded by, or aerial assaulted by the Turks at the moment. So there is a great degree of fluidity in the situation. However, this was not completely unforeseeable. These arguments were made in the courts to say that those camps were not likely to be permanent and war was likely to overtake the situation there. Now we're going to look at, 100,000 people who may bleed out of those camps into the hinterland, or a lot of people being killed, and women and children.
And, her case aside, what worries me, we can go all the way back to 2015, when the boats first started crossing the Mediterranean, when ISIS very, very boldly, publicly said they would send their operatives into Europe, and of course that means ultimately, in some cases, onto us. Is the Home Secretary not right, and the Foreign Secretary not right, to say that right now we should freeze all asylum applications?
No, I agree with that.
You do agree with that?
Because the situation in Syria is so potentially toxic that we do not know who's, and we will not know who's able to come over through a relatively porous scheme. But Shamima Begum's is not the case as the...
it's a different case.
Yeah, it's a different case indeed.
Fine. I'm joined by Charlie Downs, political strategist and former content lead at the Centre for Migration Control, and, interestingly, Joe Phillips, former Paddy Ashdown press secretary, but more significantly, somebody that knows Syria, lived in Syria. I'd love to share some of your experiences of that country and what's been happening there.
Well, I am, like so many people, Nigel, absolutely delighted to see the fall of Assad. But like so many people, I was completely and utterly conned by him. I was a member of the British Syrian Society, and we honestly believed that when he became president, that he was a reformer. You know, as you said in your introduction, he trained here as an ophthalmologist.
Yeah.
He was married to a woman who'd grown up and been brought up in this country, albeit with, you know, Syrian heritage. And we really honestly believed that he was going to change things. And he had all the opportunities. You know, we were running events and conferences to open investment, to promote the tourism and the culture and the history of the country. And then the entire the British members of the British Syrian Society, we resigned en masse when it was quite clear what was happening and the fact that, you know, there were terrible lies and things going on. But it is, I mean, as anybody who's been fortunate enough to go there knows, it is the most wonderful country. I mean, I was involved with an exhibition with the V&A. First time it had been taken stuff back to Syria. And it was astonishing. It is a beautiful country. It's rich in culture, heritage, art. And it was the country where you could actually walk around and it felt very cohesive. You could see women in full burqas walking along the road with somebody...
And mixed religion. People sitting in Damascus of all different religions.
Absolutely, you know, Greek Orthodox
Just a decade ago.
Yes, absolutely.
What do you make of the rebel forces? Is it? I mean, can we interpret who they really are?
I think we can probably say we need to keep a very close eye on the deeds that will speak more than the words. You know, we know that HTS is apparently no longer Al-Qaeda.
Do we believe that?
I think it's not impossible to believe, but I think we need to wait and see. I mean, I think, you know, as you said, it is so complicated and there are so many factions. But the one thing I would say is that most of the Syrians I know can't wait to go back to their home.
Well, this is the funny thing, isn't it? Because we're talking about whether, you know, Shamima can come back and whether we might potentially make mistakes and open the doors to terrorists. But there is an argument that if there is some settled form of government, a lot of people, I mean, over 7 million Syrians displaced, half of them in Turkey. Yeah. There is an argument they might go back. Charlie, what do you make of the situation there?
Well, between 2014 and 2024, 20,000 Syrians were resettled in the UK as part of various different government schemes. Yep. And if those people aren't then sent back to Syria, what we have is not an asylum system. What we have is a system whereby people from poorer parts of the world are able to migrate to richer parts of the world. That's really all it is. And if Syria does not receive these people back, for one thing, I think they're going to have a harder time rebuilding. And for another, it will, you know, again, it will show our system to be fundamentally broken.
Well, you don't know what those 20,000 people do.
Well,
are any of them working?
Do you mean
doctors?
what skill sets they've got?
Yes, exactly. I mean, are some of them employed as doctors?
But it seems like Syria needs those people.
What is for certain
of course it does.
is that for Syria to rebuild, it is going to need some of the 7 million that have fled.
Yeah.
And that is absolutely right.
And if we assume, as we're told so often, that all of these people are doctors, engineers, lawyers, etc., then that's even more reason for them to return.
No, I get the point. And I mean, look, I don't know which way this is going to go. None of us know which way this is going to go.
The only thing I would say, Nigel, is that, you know, after the civil war in Lebanon, it did manage to create a fragile sort of peace and civic government and civil society, bringing in just as much a complicated mixture of religions and ethnic groups. And the one thing that I think is quite encouraging about what's happening, as far as I can tell, is that HTS have been talking to civil society groups and they have made it clear that they want institutions to carry on. You know, they're not going in and just wrecking.
Well, I hope that's right.
Let's hope.
And what do you make of the Shamima Begum case?
Well, I think what Tasnime was saying is very interesting. It is that difference between, you know, the judiciary and politics. And, of course, it is a very politically emotional and toxic case that creates a very, very strong feeling, not least of all on, you know, GB News and other outlets. But I do think there is perhaps an argument for a trial. And I think, given that, you know, if she is being held in a detention camp which may just disintegrate, then what? Wouldn't it be better to let her come back here and have a fair trial?
Charlie, just one moment. I'll let you have the final word on this, I promise. Charlie, should Shamima Begum, should we reconsider the case?
I struggle with that, to be honest, knowing what we know about Shamima Begum, and this is not a story that I've read about recently, but, you know, I remember this was when I was kind of growing up that this story was really exploding, and I remember thinking at the time, well, you know, this is a girl who, sure, she was born in Britain, if I recall correctly, but she left to go to Syria to fight for ISIS, or not fight for ISIS, rather, but to be involved in
ISIS bride,
in some capacity. Is that really the kind of person that we want in our
The argument
country?
against that would be that she was 15 when she went.
Well, maybe, but again, I mean, you know, are we to believe that she's completely reformed and expunged these ideas from her head?
And Tasnime, that's the hard bit, isn't it? That first interview she gave, she was pretty unrepentant about her views.
I think it was Anthony Lloyd who interviewed her, and he published that story pretty much without editorial at all. So we got it all very sort of square. And he spent many months afterwards trying to convince Parliament to actually have her repatriated, because in his view, the one person who can commentate on her views and the context of it, he spent his time and energy to try and convince Parliament to bring her back. But the idea that we expect our Syrians who are now, you know, many of them with indefinite leave to remain in the UK, some of them will be citizens, to go back to their home country because that's what the patriotic thing to do is, despite whatever they may be up to here, without even asking that question, it's a little bit hypocritical to then say we're not going to have one of our own back who was a child when she was
So that's the
born down
trade?
there. Yeah.
No, and that's a fairly reasonable point. Well, there's one Syrian I want to leave the country, and he's called Madapassa. And, of course, he'd gone to Sweden, where he'd been arrested for knife crime. He made his way to the UK on a small boat. He's repeatedly publicly threatened to kill me. He's currently in custody. I think he really ought to return to Syria. Thank you, everybody. Very complex, very difficult debate. There are no absolute answers. We're going to watch what happens in Syria with interest. We're also going to hope and pray that the new regime is markedly better than the last one.